Japan's cabinet today approved a record defense budget.
Japan is nervous.
That's its largest military budget since World War II.
They elected their first female prime minister who is dead set on changing Japan's defense posture. After decades of low spending, Japan is increasing its defense budget to a historic 2% of GDP, and they are moving towards becoming a more traditional military power. The Japanese archipelago gives it a large sea area, but these northern waters are disputed by Russia, and this southern part is disputed by China, and that's where tensions are rising.
Tokyo might intervene militarily if Beijing invades Taiwan.
Within this area lie small rocky islands, which are strategically situated near this channel. Since the early 2010s, Chinese Coast Guard vessels have entered these waters on average over 100 times per month to signal that China doesn't recognize Japanese sovereignty. Japan also sits near North Korea, and since World War II, they have dealt with these security risks by maintaining a strict pacifist posture. But the rules that have kept East Asia stable are now being rewritten. And is it getting safer? This is Japan's military comeback with hindsight. In November last year, the Japanese PM stirred up some wind. She implied that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could trigger a Japanese military response, to which the following day a Chinese diplomat responded, "We have no choice but to cut off that dirty neck." This post was later deleted, but it followed a diplomatic clash.
The dispute has led to the Asian neighbor's biggest crisis in years.
Takaichi won a supermajority in parliament in February 2026, giving her far-reaching powers over Japan's new political direction. She intends to drastically reform Japan's defense posture, and the US is even trying to pressure Japan to further increase defense spending to 3.5%. But what will she do? We are witnessing a historic pivot in how Japan positions itself in East Asia, and China sits at the center of this dispute. In 1945, Japan lay in ruins. Its cities were destroyed and millions of people were displaced or were homeless. They had surrendered unconditionally, and US General Douglas MacArthur led the Allied occupation. The US sought to create a new balance of power, and a core pillar was a strong and unified China. They had backed the nationalist government during the Civil War, which they hoped would come out of top to lead China. And another key pillar of their newly envisioned balance of power was to disarm Japan. The United States sought to establish military bases in this region to protect trade routes. And the new Japanese constitution that was adopted in 1947 said the Japanese people would forever renounce war. And to accomplish this, land, sea and air forces would never be maintained. In other words, they cannot have a traditional military. But it didn't go as planned.
A monster rally in Shanghai celebrates communism's greatest victory since the coup in Czechoslovakia.
The warring side of the Chinese Civil War that counted on US support was losing against the communists, and they were forced to retreat to Taiwan. The communists declared the People's Republic of China, and then the Korean War broke out. Japan was surrounded by conflict and constitutionally restrained from having a military, but they established a special police force that gradually evolved into its own defensive institution. By the 1950s, the US-led order in East Asia was rebuilt around constraining communist China. They had largely excluded China from dialogue, while the Chinese deeply resented the Japanese.
Tired old men who once ruled with iron now awaited judgment.
Decades earlier, in 1937, the Japanese Imperial Army was waging war on China, and after they captured the city of Nanjing, they carried out mass killings and widespread atrocities against civilians. Estimates on the exact death toll vary, but most sources cite at least 100,000 deaths. One of the top Japanese commanders during this massacre was honored at a memorial in Tokyo, along with 13 other Class A war criminals, and this became a recurring source of friction between China and Japan. The two countries established diplomatic and economic ties in the 1970s, but when a sitting Japanese prime minister visited this memorial, it led to widespread protests in China. They accused Japan of downplaying Japanese atrocities in school books and portraying Japan mainly as a victim of World War II. East Asia's new security framework was deeply flawed. Washington had built separate alliances with Japan, South Korea and Taiwan, where these governments depended heavily on US military guarantees, rather than creating a regional framework. US strategic interests were often prioritized over solving historical disputes, and this regional order is now breaking down. So that is the backstory for now, and Japan is currently going through a historic pivot of its defense posture. But before we get to that, I quickly want to thank today's sponsor. We can't make these videos without sponsors, and today's sponsor has supported us for a very long time. Do you receive a lot of junk mail and robot calls? There exists an entire industry out there of companies who are collecting your personal information and who are selling this behind your back. So the good news is that you have the right to privacy. You can actually go to these data brokers and ask them to delete your information, and by law they are required to do so. But the problem with this approach is that it's a very tedious and time-consuming task. Incogni has automated this process for you. They reach out to data brokers on your behalf and make requests for data to be deleted. They already took my data off 208 lists, and they're working on 8 more at this very moment. In the activity log, you can see exactly of which list your data has recently been deleted. If you want to restore your privacy, Incogni is offering a 60% discount of an annual plan if you use my link in the pinned comment or in the description. That's 60% off an annual plan. And now, let's go back to the video. Japan can't have a traditional military because it's restrained by Article 9 of its constitution. But despite this, they have the 10th largest military budget in the world. And their armed forces work with some of the most technologically advanced equipment in the entire world. They might not be the largest, but they are still huge. And this was quietly built up over time. In the period between 1960 and 1990, their defense expenditure increased nearly 5-fold. This added tremendous defensive capabilities to Japan's armed forces, but it wasn't like today. It didn't mark a clear shift in Japan's defense posture, but instead their defense budget rose proportional to Japan's economy, just like we're seeing today with China. And if we lay out Japan's defense expenditure as a percentage of GDP, you see that it never exceeded 1%. But that changed over the last couple of years. And this time around, it's because they're rethinking their defense, and whether Japan's constitutional restraints on its military are still relevant in today's security landscape. And while much of the mainstream media present this as a sudden 180-degree shift, it was actually long in the making.
1 million North Koreans marched through the capital Pyongyang Wednesday, celebrating the Stalinist country's 50th anniversary. Columns of soldiers goose-stepped before leader Kim Jong-il.
In 1998, North Korea launched a long-range missile over Japanese territory, and this changed perceptions. The Japanese constitution specifically states that Japan cannot develop war potential, but it doesn't clearly define what that means. For example, if Japan finds a missile that's heading to a US warship, they couldn't legally shoot it down because it was aimed at an ally and not at Japan, which would not technically count as self-defense. The newly perceived threat of North Korea made Japan's geography suddenly feel unsafe, and that's when China started growing. China had huge manpower, and they were armed with nuclear weapons. Around 2000, China's military budget exceeded Japan's for the first time, and this was quietly building up tensions in the region, and particularly around these disputed islands. In 2010, a Chinese fishing boat was driving near these islands when it was confronted by the Japanese Coast Guard. The boats collided, which the Japanese interpreted as intentional, and they arrested the Chinese captain.
Is this the moment of maritime drama which sparked the worst political row in years between China and Japan?
This was fiercely condemned by China, who responded by suspending high-level contracts. Across China, protests broke out against Japan. This blew new life into the dispute over these islands, and in 2012, the Japanese government purchased 3 of these islands from a private Japanese owner. This was interpreted by China as a unilateral change to the status quo, and this is when Shinzo Abe returned as Prime Minister.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has called for a review of the constitution, which could lead to the military being permitted to fight overseas for the first time since World War II.
One of his main campaign promises was to change Japan's security posture.
The record defense budget will go towards new surveillance aircraft and F-35 stealth fighters, together with amphibious vehicles and drones. Tokyo's military investment is intended to counter the changing security threats of the region.
He wanted to reinterpret Article 9 to increase defense spending and to strengthen the alliance with the United States. Japan is an island nation, and most strategic pressure comes from the ocean. The northern regions that are disputed by Russia involves a number of small islands that were seized by the Soviet Union in 1945 and which Japan still claims. And they also have a dispute with South Korea over these small rocky islands, which remains politically sensitive. And they have overlapping claims in this part of the East China Sea. In the 1970s, they established the Joint Development Zone, where they could explore potential resources together, but the underlying dispute remains unresolved. These disputes are less central in Japanese security planning, but they still remain relevant. The Japanese conduct frequent submarine patrols and flights around these areas, but the most important flashpoint is, without a doubt, near China.
A diplomatic war of words between China and Japan is escalating, and a long-standing territorial dispute is at the center of it all.
On Saturday, China announced the establishment of what it calls the East China Sea Air Defense Identification Zone, declaring that all aircraft flying through must notify Chinese authorities.
China has invested massively in its navy, and these warships could be used to take control over shipping routes during times of war.
The U.S. considers the skies above them international airspace, and tensions are rising fast.
A second core element of Japanese security is its air defense. The main threats here come from China and North Korea. Japan and the United States have built a dense network of radar stations that scan long distances for aircrafts and missiles. And this is backed up by mobile units and radars on ships. Japan for decades structured its security posture around mostly defensive capabilities, while relying heavily on US guarantees. And that is now changing. Abe stepped down in 2020 and his successors largely followed the same line. For the first time since World War II, Japan was now openly discussing striking enemy bases if it were attacked. They announced plans to acquire long-range cruise missiles, and elections were coming up.
A coalition swept to a landslide election win. The victory paves the way for Takaichi's tax cuts that have spooked financial markets and military spending aimed at countering China.
Takaichi became Japan's first female prime minister. Her government is currently preparing one of the most ambitious military expansions in modern Japanese history. But her approach widely differs from her predecessors. For decades, Japan expanded its military by reinterpreting Article 9 of its constitution. Her predecessors were looking for workarounds, but Takaichi wants to end that ambiguity. Her aim is to formally rewrite the constitution, transforming Japan from a state that avoids war in principle into one that openly prepares for it. At the same time, she is trying to manage the region's sensitivities. She has avoided visiting that shrine in Tokyo that many across Asia see as honoring convicted war criminals. This is intended as a signal that Japan's military normalization does not have to come with a provocation. But China obviously doesn't really see it that way. They are very suspicious of Japan, and they see these moves as a return to Japan's militarism. They interpret this as a containment strategy, and they argue that Japan is destabilizing the regional balance. This transformation is also happening under pressure at home. Japan is facing a rampant cost of living crisis. Prices are rising incredibly fast, and even staples like rice are becoming expensive. Critics argue that Japan can't afford to become stronger abroad while its population is feeling weaker at home. But Takaichi was elected with a near unprecedented majority of the vote. The scale of this victory matters. It shows that Japanese voters are increasingly open to having a more proactive security posture. Those who support this change argue that deterrence prevents conflict. They believe that a Japan who can defend its islands and who can respond to crises around Japan independently has a reduced risk of miscalculation. In this view, Japan isn't abandoning restraint, it is adapting to a changing security landscape. Today, one of the most likely places where a US-China war could break out is around Taiwan, and that is also around Japan. So Takaichi wasn't the one that started Japan's military comeback, but she added a lot of permanence, and she is doubling down on this approach. If you want to support my work and help me continue making these kinds of videos, consider liking this video or writing a short positive comment down in the comment section. That really helps with pushing this video further into the YouTube algorithm. And then after that, if you want to see more, here are 2 more videos that you can consider for your next watch.